All right, it's time. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon to some. Um, Welcome to today's American Community Media's weekly national briefing. I'm Pilar Marrero, your moderator for today. Is American democracy in decline? In the first 100 days of Donald Trump's return to the presidency, concern about the direction of the country has grown sharply, and the public is paying attention. A recent poll by the nonpartisan Public Religion Research Institute found that more than half of Americans, 52%, agree with the statement that Trump is, quote, a dangerous dictator. Another poll from ABC News, The Washington Post, and Ipsos found that nearly half, 49%, and that was the largest chunk, believe this president is expanding his authority, ignoring the rule of law, and moving the country away from its founding principles. What's behind this concern? There is a clear pattern. President Trump increasingly claims his power is absolute, beyond question. He has attacked the judiciary, sidelined qualified experts in favor of loyalists, and treated institutions like universities and the independent press as enemies of the state. His administration appears to use the machinery of government to reward allies and punish critics. According to hundreds of democracy scholars, these are classic signs of a country moving towards an autocracy. So we ask, is the United States drifting toward authoritarianism? And if so, what can be done? Today's panel brings deep expertise to that question. Together, they'll explore how democracies weaken from within and whether our institutions are strong enough to resist. Let me introduce our panel. Lucan Way is Distinguished Professor of Democracy at the University of Toronto. He's an expert on authoritarian regimes and democratic transitions. He has a recent article in Foreign Affairs where he takes a hard look at the risk facing American democracy right now. And he had an article just yesterday at the opinion page of the New York Times with two other co-writers. Aziz Huq is the Frank and Bernice Greenberg Professor of Law at the University of Chicago. He's a scholar of US and comparative constitutional law and has written extensively about how legal systems behave under democratic stress. Gloria Brown Marshall is a professor of constitutional law at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and a civil rights attorney. Her work focuses on law, race, and the future of American democracy. Her latest book is A Protest History of the United States, and it came out just April 22nd. So we're honored to have all three of you with us today. We ask you to please speak slowly for interpreters. We have interpreters in Spanish, Korean, and Mandarin for our reporters. And we ask reporters to enter questions in the chat. Our speakers are also encouraged to answer questions in the chat throughout the conference if they can. We will send a video of today's briefing and expanded bios with contact information for each speaker to all participants later today. And so I am going to start by asking a question from each of you, followed by questions by me and by the audience of reporters. You have about 3 or 4 minutes to answer the initial question, so we have time for other rounds, and then we'll just go to Q&A, going around the table. So my first question is for Professor Lucan Way. Your recent Foreign Affairs article, which you co-wrote with Stephen Levitsky, outlines a possible American path to authoritarianism. Also, yesterday's opinion piece in the New York Times with two authors talks about a similar issue. Can you summarize what sets the US case apart from the typical autocrat's playbook?
So, thank you, and thank you for inviting me here. It's a real pleasure being and speaking in front of this audience. I think what's striking about the U.S. case is that when we wrote the piece in Foreign Affairs, we wrote it actually before the inauguration. We expected a path that was much more in line with cases like Hungary and Poland, which was relatively slow and legalistic in its kind of attack on authoritarianism, involving things like, changes in laws of how to, ways of firing civil servants and the like. But what we've seen is something much more dramatic and rapid. I mean, this is really, much more rapid, you know, effort at imposing authoritarianism than we've seen in places like Hungary, Turkey, India, any of those places. Actually, So this is that's the really big difference. And also the sort of open disregard for the courts and court rulings and legality. I think that's something that was, quite surprising to us. I can't hear you. Sorry.
I'm so sorry. I was muted. I apologize. Did you finish?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I will move on to a question for Professor Huck. Professor Huck, there's been many lawsuits filed against Trump executive actions and decisions. Many judges from all political persuasions have decided against his decisions. The administration seems to be complying with some orders and not with others. What happens when a president defies judges and calls them a disgrace or rejects their decisions?
Thanks, Pilar, for that question. Building upon what Professor Wei, I think, correctly described, in the first few months of the Trump administration, we've observed a pattern of both partial non-compliance with court orders and a broad-ranging, both rhetorical and legal attack on the court system to the extent it acts as a check on the executive branch. On the first, in the immigration context, and in the spending context, there have been judicial orders that have required actions where I think it is not plausible to speak of good faith compliance. And in response to pressure from the courts, we've seen not just rhetorical attacks from the White House, from its congressional allies, but also attacks from private parties associated with the president's political movement that have picked out certain judges and certain members of those judges' families for public contempt and threats of perhaps something worse. So I think it is important to see the pattern of non-compliance in the context of a broader campaign to discourage or scare federal judges into not issuing orders adverse to the administration. In the face of this, judges do not have many options. Judge Boasberg in the District of Columbia triggered what is generally seen as the most important of those options, which is the possibility of a contempt proceeding through which criminal sanctions are imposed upon government officials or government lawyers. The appeals court in Washington, D.C. stayed Judge Boasberg's contempt proceeding in mid-April. And so we have yet to see whether this one tool that the courts have for forcing compliance will work, even though we've had a multiplicity of instances in which court orders have not been obeyed.
I keep not unmuting myself today. I don't know what's going on. Now let's go to Professor Brown Marshall. Back when we talked about a year and a half ago in another briefing, you told us that a constitutional crisis has existed before in this country, and it existed, for example, against African Americans. You say that this community is the canary in the mine. Can you expand on your view of what's happening today and how the attacks against immigrants, foreign students, and others are part of this trend?
Well, when we think about the abuses of power as have been set out by both Professor Huck and Professor Wei, we understand that we had grown used to these methods of undermining citizenship and constitutional protections when it came to people of African descent and other communities that had been politically or economically marginalized. But it was always assumed in this country that it would have a limit there. But all we did as a nation was to grow numb to the cries of those people and their arguments, and in many ways be very dismissive that, you know, what are they doing wrong, that they are not part of the American family as full citizens. And so now we see that the practice of constitutional crisis that was applied there is now spreading, being expanded to other groups. And as it's expanded, we begin to watch it in real time. And I think that has frightened many people who were used, or as I said, numb to the fact that constitutional rights, protections of free speech, equal protection, and other rights under the Constitution, voting rights, were being ignored for the most part, or just outright voter suppression was being allowed and ignored by the majority community. But as we see the tough student being taken away by people in some aspect of authority, we still really don't know, with a mask on, and putting handcuffs on students, taking them away. When we start to see this play out and we think, oh, but that's just the immigrant student, what did they do wrong? It's always the assumption that the person who is being undermined as far as their constitutional rights has done something to deserve it. And so then we begin to see the citizen taken away. We began to see the foreign students, or not just the foreign students, but the students in general. We're not sure if they're citizens or not. Are we asking that question? When we start to see the attacks on the universities, and the continued attack, and in the ways in which our federal government is abusing the general population now, the concern is those who voted for Trump are saying, well, we're used to those people, maybe the sexual orientation group, the Black group, the Latino group, the immigrant group. Those are the people who are supposed to get the brunt of the constitutional disdain. But as we watch the expansion of the abuse of power, it's frightening that we were indeed, as I said in 2023, the canary in the mine. And as others watched, as women's watch their rights be eroded, we began to better understand you cannot allow those who have been marginalized to allow their rights to continue to be undermined, because they would only spread an authoritarian power. It was pointed out in the brilliant article by Professor Way that it doesn't become appeased with acquiescence and capitulation. It only grows stronger.
Yeah, and thank you, Professor. And I wanted to do a follow-up to Professor Way. In both articles that I quoted, you talk about something called competitive authoritarianism. Some people have in their minds authoritarian is just like a military coup, and people just run military down the street. That's not what happens in this kind of authoritarian regime, or regime change, or whatever you want to call it. And you mentioned places like Venezuela, where I'm from, and I know it took a long time in Venezuela to really actually undermine the democracy we had, and for people to realize that they actually did not live in a democracy anymore. What is competitive authoritarianism?
Right, thanks. Well, first of all, I want to emphasize that, by our measure, Venezuela today is a full-scale classic dictatorship. So just to, so there not be any confusion on that. But you're right that sort of the nature of authoritarianism has changed quite dramatically in the last, 50 or so years. You used to sort of see kind of military coups in Chile in 1973. But today, most autocrats, I have a precise number, according to my measure, 63% of dictators are elected today. So it's a really different type of dictatorship. And this is what we call competitive authoritarianism. These are cases like Hungary, Turkey, India, where you do have regular elections, right? And there's opposition that's allowed to campaign openly and sometimes even win elections. So that, for the sort of normal person on the street, they think, well, this is a democracy. But in fact, what goes on is that you have a whole series of more subtle types of often legal or semi-legal abuse. This is sort of anything from sort of defamation suits to online harassment, things that basically increase the costs of opposition, right? And create what we have today in the United States, which is, unambiguously competitive authoritarianism, and democracy is very much over. And I just want to also just follow up on what Professor Brown Marshall was talking about. She's absolutely right. I mean, I think all of us here recognize that the history of democracy in the United States has been, suffice to say, quite imperfect. I mean, that sort of African Americans, that the left and other civil rights activists have long suffered the brunt of American authoritarianism. So it's not like, democratic crisis is anything new in the United States. Nonetheless, I think, and this is something we argue with Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Zeblat, that what we see now is something distinctly different. That in contrast to before, it's no longer simply even mainstream opposition is now costly. Think of the the lawyers in the law firms. These are people who never historically have faced any kind of challenge by supporting one of the two major parties. This is not the case anymore. I mean, this is truly a major, significant break from past American history. So in a sense, we obviously have attacks on the sort of minorities, on the kind of and other groups, immigrants, certainly African Americans. But in addition, now that has been joined by attacks on kind of mainstream institutions, the media and the like. So I think that is really kind of a major, shift in American history going on, right now.
Well, I'm going to go to the chat because we have a number of questions and they are great. Peter, you want to ask your question? Peter Sherman from American Community Media.
Hi, thank you. Sorry, I was trying to unmute. I posted in the chat this question, and I just want to add another piece to it, and would love to hear what the speakers have to say. So, during the campaign, there was a lot of, and sort of in the sort of post-campaign dissection, there was a lot of criticism of Biden and Harris leaning too heavily into democracy as a theme, and that perhaps they didn't lean heavily enough into bread and butter issues. And so I'm wondering, what the speakers think about whether the electorate has shifted on this question now that Trump has returned. Are people rethinking the importance of democracy now that we see it potentially slipping away? And I just wanted to add one other piece to this. We at American Community Media, we've been covering voter suppression, gerrymandering, all of these things. How much has the nationalization of politics and the loss of local politics fed into the sort of demise of people valuing democracy in this country?
Anyone? Any of you?
I would just like to say very quickly, just on the heels of Professor Way, I push back on the idea that this is brand new. There is very little that's being experienced in this country that has not been experienced by the African American community. As somebody who has lived in my brown body my entire life and seen my relatives go through many things, from voter suppression to the undermining of the Black press. The reason why there is a Black press is because, reporters of color could not join the majority presses. So there's so much that has happened. And I write about it in my book, Race, Law, and American Society. It was one of my first books. And I think if more white people in this country understood the African American experience, clearly they would see this is an expansion. They practiced on us in a way, and they've expanded so much to others. But I want to touch on the question as well. I do believe there's a mixture here, that what was learned was how the local elections and those people who are in the local elections were part of a national scheme. So even when it started off with just telling people nationally, join and run your Board of Education, join these local groups and committees that control your community. But that was told from a national platform. So it was the nationalization of local politics so that they would walk with one step and have this one theme that would allow them to come together under this Trumpian tent. and the regime that we have now. And others might disagree with that, but I can see, to the last point, I think there should have been more bread and butter issues from the Democratic Party. There should have been people who could use the word poor and working class and poverty, which they never did. They always focused on the middle class, from President Obama, until present, and Harris. They were all like repeating the mantra of the middle class. And that is something that I think made a lot of the bread and butter issues seem more important or less thoughtful to those who were voting. But I have to say there was a manipulation of fear, and I hope we get to that later. That is also something that this country is known for when it tries to bring together this nationalist viewpoint. So I'll stop there.
Okay. Anyone else wants to make a comment? If not, we'll move on. All right.
All right.
Okay. Yes, Logan?
I just want to, I guess, make a couple things to that question. First of all, I mean, Professor Brown Marshall is absolutely right. This is something not new. I mean, we oftentimes think of the United States as being the world's oldest democracy. In reality, by any standard definition of democracy, we've only been a democracy, or we're a democracy since the early 1970s with the implementation of the of the Voting Rights Act. So I think that's important to emphasize. I also think in terms of appreciation of democracy, it's right that democracy kind of was sort of off the radar for a lot of people in the run up to the election. But I think that's probably changing. It's a little bit like vaccines, right? For those of us who have never, had to experience measles or polio, we don't think vaccines are really necessary. But now we're kind of about to experience the political equivalent of smallpox and polio and those kind of diseases, which I think will increase our appreciation of the importance of democracy.
Okay, sounds good. There's more questions. Let me check. Okay, Henrietta, ask your question, please.
Thank you, Pilar. What happens when the president of the U.S. is held in contempt and this ruling is upheld? What could ultimately happen?
I'm happy to take that since it's a question about legal rules. It strikes me as being vanishingly likely that a president would ever be held in contempt. There are two reasons for that. The first is that even in ordinary matters, judges are very sparing of the way in which they use the contempt power for ordinary litigants, and in particular for government litigants. So it is extremely uncommon, even in instances in which U.S. attorneys or agents of the federal government who are working with U.S. attorneys, even in those cases in which they violate a rule or are not forthcoming, nonetheless, it is extremely difficult to find instances in which judges impose sanctions on them. A reason for that is, in the background, is the fact that federal judges and U.S. attorneys or other government lawyers all work for the same employer. They're all employed by the federal government, and they have a very clear shared understanding of that identity. So as a background fact, it is just extremely rare for contempt to be issued against a governmental lawyer. The second fact that makes the hypothesis Henrietta asked about, I think, practically impossible, is the decision of the US Supreme Court in Trump versus United States to the effect that the president is absolutely immune in the exercise of what the court characterized as his core constitutional authorities from criminal prosecution or investigation. One of the activities that the court characterized as core is the management and direction of prosecution. And so, to the extent that a president orders non-compliance with a court order, it is a matter of now settled law as of July 2024 that there is no remedy through the judicial system for that action.
Okay. All right, let's just move to another question for all of you, for anyone that wants to answer. There's been a lot of discussion about due process in the case of the migrants that have been put on planes and sent overseas with the use of the Alien Enemies Act without any hearing in immigration or criminal court. Donald Trump just said in an interview, hey, it would just take too long to do all the trials to the poor people. Essentially, he does not want to comply with the law in order to do what he wants to do. Why is due process? Why should I care about the due process of an immigrant or even a criminal immigrant, which in most cases is not the case that we're talking about? Anyone?
I'm happy to address it if it's a law, to the extent it's a law question. I apologize for speaking twice in a row.
Oh, no, it's okay.
So due process is a phrase found in both the Fifth and the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution. And it is understood as the right to notice and a hearing before the government takes an action that is adverse to your interests. That action might be taking away a benefit like Social Security, or it might be imposing a penalty like imprisonment or deportation. The justification for due process is twofold. The first is the idea that as individual human beings, we have a dignitary entitlement to confront accusations or arguments against us and to respond. And I emphasize the idea that this is a right that adheres in humans, not citizens, because the due process clause extends to both citizens and non-citizens, regardless of their status. The second justification of due process turns upon consequences, and in particular, on the risk of governmental error. Due process is a mechanism by which individuals can protect themselves against an erroneous government action. So if the government arrests, as it does with some regularity, if the government arrests a citizen and tries to deport them, due process entitles the citizen to object to the facts upon which the government is relying. So due process matters, in fact, less to the person, for example, for whom there is a valid legal ground for removal, than it matters to the citizen or the non-citizen who has a lawful right to be present, notwithstanding the error made by the government. So I think it is a profound mistake to think of due process as something that shields the culpable, the person who has violated the law. It does in some ways, but much more importantly, due process is a protection against the arbitrary and erroneous action of the government against those for which it has no reason to act. So due process is really a right for all of us, not just for the Mr. Abrego Garcias of the world.
I'd like to add, thank you. That was brilliant. I'd like to add just one part, and that's about the Alien Enemies Act and immigration. And one of the issues first, the Alien Enemies Act, this ancient law that was put in place during the colonial period in the early part of the country, I should say, to actually protect the country from so-called people who were could be purveyors of violence against the country in its early stages. And it was used in a very vague way against immigrants and allowing people to be deported. But so many people were immigrants during that time period. There were more immigrants than citizens for the most part. But the courts have already said, to that end, the application of the Alien Enemies Act is not constitutional so far in the way it's being applied by the government. But in the case of immigration proceedings for the most part are civil, not criminal. And so when we're looking for our due process rights to be applied, many of us are looking for it to be applied from the standpoint of a criminal process. And this is actually a civil process. So there's no guarantee of counsel when it comes to immigration cases. And one of the points of the Constitution is that the trial is supposed to take place where the alleged crime what took place. In this point, there is no crime. So that's why if people ask, how is it that someone could be transferred from New Jersey or New York to Louisiana, is because these are civil cases and they're without counsel. So there are a lot of issues here in which due process, as was pointed out by Professor Huck, is so necessary so that people actually know why they're being held. If it has an issue to do with them being in the country illegally, how is it termed to be illegal unless they're applying the Alien Enemies Act, where the courts have already said this is not applicable. So there's so many things that need to be brought before the court for plain view for all of us to see, and without due process, so that there is a time in court for us to hear the arguments of the government, for a person to be able to take a stand, for an attorney to be able to set out the law. Then that means that this person being deported is not being able to even know why they are being deported. And these are the types of issues, as I said, once they begin to practice on what is considered marginalized population, it takes very little to move and expand to others. So we should all be very much aware of what is taking place when it comes to immigration and the process and lack of due process here.
May I quickly make one additional point, Pilar?
Sure, absolutely.
I think this point is worth making because Professor Brown Marshall mentioned the possibility of transfer. The Constitution contains a provision that prevents the government from suspending habeas corpus. What does that mean? Habeas corpus is a right that goes back to at least Stuart, England, by which an individual is entitled to claim in court that he or she is wrongly detained. Habeas corpus complements due process, but it stands apart and has its own mechanisms. One of the important rules that has emerged with respect to due process, with respect to habeas corpus, is when an individual who has been detained files a habeas corpus petition in the local court, which is the place they have to file it in as a consequence of federal procedural rules, it is not lawful for the government to move that person out of the jurisdiction. It is not lawful once the habeas petition has been filed to move the person to a different part of the United States, let alone to another country. This legal rule is of immense importance, in particular in the cases of students who have been arrested on the basis of speech they have engaged in with respect to political questions, where the arrest has been followed by a move to a different jurisdiction, usually Louisiana. It is, I think, important for people to know that if they know someone who is detained under similar circumstances, the filing of the habeas petition makes it unlawful for the government to move that person out of the jurisdiction. I realize that is a highly technical point, but it has rather substantial repercussions for both the individual concerned and the trajectory of any likely litigation, and so thought it was worth mentioning.
Thank you so much. Professor Wei, I wanted to go back to a point that you made in the article that came out in the New York Times. And you and your co-writers made the point that Americans will know whether we're already in an out of a democracy or in an authoritarian regime when the cost of opposing the government is very high. Are we there yet?
Definitely. I mean, I think you know, part of the essential element of democracy is that we're able to criticize the government, but not have to worry about things like having an increased chance of your taxes being audited or kind of foregoing certain business opportunities or the like, or suffering any harassment. What we have now is a situation in which, for many Americans, both minorities, immigrants, but also sort of parts of the core parts of the American establishment, they have to now think twice about whether to oppose Donald Trump. So we've already seen a massive impact on this level. We see donors who are scared to give to the Democratic Party or left-wing causes for fear of retribution. We see self-censorship in the media. I mean, and this is, to me, one of the most gut-wrenching, awful impact, which is that because of the nature of corporate ownership, CBS is owned by Paramount, which has interest before the federal government. It has engaged it basically in extra oversight over 60 Minutes, which is, of course, as everybody knows, the kind of essential television program in the United States, which has uncovered many kind of corruption and historically. As a result, because of this action, Bill Owens, the longtime executive producer of 60 Minutes, has resigned. So this suggests that sort of the media is under dire threat because the costs of opposition have increased, quite significantly. I mean, we're not in a kind of Russia territory. People so far are not imprisoned and poisoned and the like, but still the costs have really increased greatly just over in the last 3 months or so.
Nobody thrown out a window yet.
Not yet.
Okay, not yet. It's funny, not funny. There's a couple of questions in the chat about, what do we do? What do Americans do? What are the defenses that we have? What are we going with this? How do we get out of this? I realize it's a hard thing to answer, but are the railings, are the safety nets or the safety the Constitution, the law, the judiciary, are they failing in some way or not? Are they still holding? Anyone?
Okay. So I think what's important. I mean, Sarah McBride, the Congresswoman from Delaware, has a saying that if all of us are a little bit more brave, you don't need heroes. So her point, I think, there is that if all of us step up, we have safety in numbers, and therefore it makes it much harder for Trump to sort of be successful in imposing authoritarianism. So one of the things I worry about when I'm giving interviews and the like is that I point out that we're now in an authoritarian regime, which is definitely the case, but somehow in people's minds that means it's irreversible. I can just tell you, having studied many autocracies for decades, it is never irreversible. And that's especially the case in the United States, where society is well resourced, incredibly robust. So I think it's really important to recognize that we can fight back, and that in fact, it's unlikely that the Republicans will succeed in consolidating autocracy. So there's a lot we can do.
I want
Okay.
to touch on that as well. You know, just some of the aspects of American history. When we go back to what happened during the Nixon presidency, and we see that he, you know, in many ways wanted to do what is taking place right now. He was trying to do it when it came to the left. He was doing this when it came to people of color, the poor, and others. He was trying to accumulate this type of power, and he was, you know, well on his way until the U.S. Supreme Court stepped in, and he, of course, stepped out. So we've gone many steps beyond what Nixon did, but I don't think it's intractable. But I will say, what was studied by this regime was our weaknesses. And what we are failing to do is to study the weaknesses of the regime, to figure out what those weaknesses are so that we can come together in a unified way. And we're in so many different silos. The law firms capitulated because they were only thinking of themselves and other law firms and their competition, you know, among the other law firms. You know, the universities were only looking at themselves as a university. So if you're looking at these different groups and everyone's in a silo, then the unity that gives us the power is being lost. So we need to study the weaknesses of the regime. We need to work together and realize that we're stronger, as pointed out. So we're stronger together. We can do more together. And I think the last part of this is the way we're using our resources. Are we even understanding what's going on right now? Because the focus of this is not just to gain power, but it's to have power as we go into the year 2045, when this nation becomes majority people of color. That's what this is about. This is about 2045 and the fear of diversity, the fear of a time period when the majority of the population will be people of color. And so this apartheid state, the foundation of which is being laid right now, is with the idea that by 2045, there will be a white patriarchy still ruling this country in the way that their values will be the values in place and not the values of a diverse democracy. They would, and one thing very quickly that Martin Luther King said in his book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? His 1967 book, the last book he wrote, he said this country, if it had to have equality, would not want democracy. He wrote this then. He understood that sharing power is very difficult. And in a country that pretends it shares power, it's even more difficult when that sharing of power becomes a reality.
I want to call on Nakia Cooper. Please ask your question about the third term, if you can.
Unmute.
Hi, Nakia.
Hi. Okay, I was trying to unmute.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So a lot of times, so what we keep hearing, and this is a great session, by the way, everyone, but what we keep hearing is that the president, even if he's joking or not, he keeps talking about running for a third term. And we see that everything else that people thought that they should not take seriously, he's showing you that you should. But nobody's standing up against anything with everything that we're seeing that we thought were unimaginable. Is this third term a reality? And if it is, like, how can he do that? And if that's the case, can Obama run for a third term then? Like, what is it? Can we bring back some of those other people? Is it time to get busy with a third term for everyone to say, okay, game on? What does that look like? Can that happen?
Yeah. I don't know, Aziz, or maybe the legal question.
I feel that if I'm responsible for answering the legal questions, I'm never the person who brings the joy. Not that either of my co-panelists are exactly leaning into celebration at this moment, so I shouldn't complain.
Yeah.
The 22nd Amendment to the US Constitution contains language that is conventionally understood to prohibit presidents from being elected or serving a third term in office. And I think until this year, had you asked any lawyer or constitutional law scholar in the United States, they would have described the 22nd Amendment as an absolute bar on individuals who've served 2 terms of the presidency from serving a third. I think that the reason for not taking that textual command to mean what it did do until January 2024, and being concerned about the possibility of the violation of term limits is based upon the following. In my view, there are other provisions in the Constitution that apply to now President Trump, and that preclude him from holding the office that he holds now. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment bars individuals who engage in rebellion, insurrection, or provide aid and comfort to either rebellion or insurrection. This language plainly and comfortably fits President Trump, given his actions on January 6th, 2021. And I think if you had asked me in February 2021 whether the language applied, I would have said, absolutely. There's no doubt, given what the facts are and what's known. Nonetheless, the Supreme Court found a way to evacuate Section 3 of its meaning. And there is a mini industry of lawyers, and I regret to say, partisan-aligned law professors who have discovered hidden depths in Section 3 that allow President Trump to escape its obvious force. In a system in which there are lawyers willing to apply their skills to undermine the obvious force of constitutional provisions, and where you have a judiciary that in its high court is reliably aligned with a certain political party, I think it is unwise to assume that language on the face of the Constitution means in practice what it means in theory.
Yeah.
I'd like to add one small part. Some
Sure.
people have put forward the proposition that J.D. Vance would then become president, and then Trump would become vice president. But the 22nd Amendment also says in the last line that no person who's ineligible for presidency can be vice president. So that's also there for those people who have heard that rumor about another backdoor to the presidency.
And can you imagine Trump being vice president? I don't think so. He
Well,
would,
just
I think he would
vice
take it.
president long enough to be president again.
So
Thank you.
I would just add that I mean I find it actually quite plausible. For example, let's imagine, which is again probably likely, that Trump, assuming his health holds, which I think his health is in some ways our biggest kind of force for democracy, if his because eventually those hamburgers have got to take some effect, I assume. That when the Republican Party nominates him for a third term, the thought that the Supreme Court is going to sort of challenge that, those kind of facts on the ground, seems really implausible to me. I mean, and so the Republican Party has already shown a great willingness to completely forego any kind of normal democratic procedure. So I actually would be quite surprised, again, assuming Trump's health holds, that he doesn't go for a third term. I think at this point it's probably the sort of likely scenario.
And I think
Well, and
Chief Justice Roberts might just retire because he doesn't want the shame to follow him and allow the Supreme Court to go the way of Trump altogether.
Jesus, wow. Okay, the last 10 minutes, I want to talk about people, what people can do. And there were a couple of questions in the chat about that, but I wanted to ask Professor Brown Marshall and others. We've seen some mobilizations, really big mobilizations and protests against this administration. If we are to face what we think is happening, what would be the role of protests, and who needs to protest and how?
The way that I look at protests is over 500 years and the different ways in which protests have been used, large and small. Protests can be something like the March on Washington, where we have hundreds of thousands of people, but it can also be very simple things, as with Rosa Parks, with one person on a bus. There are ways in which each one of us can engage in protests. Protests can be professors teaching what in their state is now outlawed. It may be that we have to have freedom schools, more programs like this, where people can learn about what's taking place, despite what the laws may be in that particular jurisdiction. I think that protest is going to have to be reporters reporting on things, despite the fact that they may be criticized for those things. I mean, we are looking at, as Professor Wade pointed out, backlash that's going to be very real and very painful for all of us. But I think it's important for us to look at our sphere of influence and figure out how we can make a difference. Yes, it can be in the street with everyone, but also it can be individual ways or small groups joining with others in some of the organizations that are being created during this time period. It could be writing a check to organizations that are doing work that you can't do right now. There are many ways in which we can take a stand, but having a voice and putting information on platforms where there's a balance for people to read, despite what's happening with the bots and everything else and the disinformation, we have to have information for people to actually have a choice. If we give up and say there's nothing we can do, then that's when that capitulation is when they win. If they have our minds, they have our bodies. So protests can take many forms, and we just need to figure out where and when we enter. But we're already in the fray. We're already in the fight.
Yes, I wanted to add polls to this, because polls are showing that not the hardcore MAGA, but there are others, the Republican Party, and there are many independents that are turning against him on several issues. So, and today I think today or yesterday, the Kaiser Family Foundation released a poll showing a majority of people, even Republicans, are against major cuts to Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, etc. So in the context of what we've talked about, are polls important? This is for everyone.
So absolutely, polls are hugely important. Not if you look at the history of autocracies, the ones that have succeeded, that have violated democracy the most, are the ones that have been very popular, like Hugo Chavez, Putin, and others, in the realm of 80%. It's the ones like President Suu Kyi in South Korea that have failed, and why is that? It's because autocracy only succeeds when those in the government apparatus go along. But people in the government apparatus who are actually implementing these autocratic measures will only go along if they think it will succeed. But if they see the public opinion going against the autocracy, then they're going to sit on their hands. And this is exactly, again, what happened in South Korea about a year ago. And what you've seen, that sort of, in a sense, the biggest reason for hope is Trump's, popularity, which is around 40%. So I think the chances of him successfully consolidating authoritarian rule at, in the high 30s or 40s is really sort of hard to believe.
But I want people not just to take polls. I want them to actually do something. I think it's necessary for people to do more than mumble behind closed doors. They're going to have to act in some way, shape, or form. It's not going to be enough. I know Americans aren't used to this. They can't believe it's happening, and we're still somewhat in that shocked time of post-election, but we have to snap out of it because, as Martin Luther King said, it was a silence of the good people. And so if we have the silence, we just have the mumbling in the background, these incremental steps of authoritarianism, it's going to really go forward as Trump and the regime feels desperate in the summer. We're going to see some desperate moves. And we need to have planning practice. But this one thing, we also have to have a vision forward. We can't just protest against something. We also have to protest for something. And I think that protesting for something can bring more people together than it can just the constantly protesting against something.
Yeah.
I guess my last, okay, go ahead.
No, I just want to say that, what's interesting is that it's really the normal people who've taken the lead in protesting so far right now. I mean, what has been shocking and appalling, I think, to everyone in this panel is the extent to which the people with power and resources who are really have the capacity to resist Trump's moves against them have been the passive ones. It's the people at the Tesla dealerships, the people in town halls, it's the hands off them. Those are the people who've taken the lead. So in a sense, when people say what needs to be done, well, the powerful also have to stand up, not just the everyday.
Very true. Very true.
Last, I mean, we have 3 minutes. And this is a very relevant question. And Sunita was putting this on the chat right now. I think that the question is, what is it that we support? Are Democrats doing what they should be doing? I mean, there's a lot of criticism about what Democrats are doing or not doing. Anyone?
I don't think Democrats right now in Congress anyway have a vision. And that's why I said there has to be a vision forward as well as a protest against. And for example, my vision forward would be democracy, power, 2045. The fear is what they're playing on. The fear gives them the wedge issues, the divide and conquer, the fear of the immigrant, the fear of diversity, the fear of classism. All of this is giving them the power that they deserve. They feel they deserve to have because they feel that the little people aren't smart enough to know what's going on. We'll just be Big Papa and give them what they need. So I really do believe that the Democrats are not able to understand that without a vision, the people perish. And right now, they're not giving us the vision, but the people themselves can give the vision.
I guess with the exception of some Democrats like, I don't know, AOC. Assis?
I think it's interesting to think about the constraints on the Democrats and the way in which the Trump project is, in an important sense, loosening those constraints. From the 90s onwards, the Democrats, like many left-of-center parties around the world, have accepted or came to accept a set of economic policies, deregulation, open markets, financial liberalization, that are usefully but roughly called neoliberalism. And by embracing the neoliberal policy agenda, the Democrats closed off many ways in which they could appeal to their historic working class base. One of the things that has happened through this second Trump presidency is that any sense of there being a coherent or cohesive neoliberal agenda or policy prescription set, I think has fragmented substantially. I think it is far less clear that there is a conventional wisdom on economic policy in the way that there was even 5 or 10 years ago. What that means, I think, is that should they choose to use it, the Democrats have much more space in which to pursue or propose policies that directly speak to some of the economic pressures that drive authoritarian populism than they were even 5 or 10 years ago. And I think that what's important to underscore here is the reason they have that freedom is Trump and the way that Trump has broken certain economic as well as legal and cultural orthodoxies.
We are over time, but let's give Luke and Wei the last word.
No, I just want to thank you, everyone. This has been a really great panel, and I've learned a lot. So thank you very much.
No, thank you. Thank you all. It's been amazing. Thank you again for being brave and showing up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Have a good weekend. Ciao.